2 o'clock, June 6, 1944. The Norman countryside lay under a blanket of low clouds, fields damp with night dew, hedgerows casting thick shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then another, their calls rising into an uneasy chorus. In a farmhouse near Carentan, a lantern flickered as a farmer leaned at his window, listening to a strange rumble in the sky. At first it did sound like thunder. A low growl, rolling across the heavens in long waves. But the rhythm was wrong, too steady, too mechanical. In the village lanes, shutters opened, faces peered upward. The rumble grew until it shook the earth itself. German sentries of the 91st Infantry Division stepped from their posts, scanning the sky. A sergeant scribbled into his diary by flashlight, "We thought it was a storm." Then we counted dozens of engines. Then hundreds. The air vibrated in our chests. And suddenly, it stopped. No more roar. Only a whisper, like fabric tearing the night. The first wave of Douglas C-47 Skytrains passed over Normandy in tight formation, their silhouettes barely visible against the dark ceiling of clouds. More than 800 aircraft filled the night, engines humming in synchronized fury. From the ground, the sky seemed alive, a living machine that stretched from horizon to horizon. Spotlights stabbed upward, slicing through the gloom. Beams caught glimpses of wings, of fuselages painted with invasion stripes. Anti-aircraft guns began to fire, shells bursting in orange blossoms high above. The sound rolled over the countryside, waking every village dog, every rooster. Yet beneath the explosions came another sound, a rapid series of thumps as doors opened on the bellies of the aircraft. Then the shadows fell. One after another, human figures poured into the night. Parachutes snapped open with sharp cracks, white canopies blooming like ghostly flowers against the sky. Dozens. Then hundreds. The air filled with them, silent shapes drifting downward, weapons strapped to their sides, boots dangling. To the Germans staring upward, it was as if the heavens themselves had opened to deliver an army. In St. Mireglise, bells began to ring wildly, whether from fire or alarm no one could say. Villagers watched from cellars and barns as the shapes descended. Some cheered in whispers, clutching each other in the dark. Others crouched in fear, not knowing whether the new arrivals would bring liberation or slaughter. On the ground, German officers shouted contradictory orders. Some insisted it must be only a handful, a diversion, a raid meant to distract from the real invasion at the beaches. But then reports crackled over field telephones, sightings of paratroopers in hedgerows, in orchards, in ditches miles apart. Machine gun nests opened fire, tracers cutting upward into the drifting figures. Men were struck before they hit the ground, their chutes collapsing into flames. Others landed hard in flooded fields, gasping as water closed over their helmets. Still others crashed into barns, into trees, into the very courtyards of enemy garrisons. A farmhand in La Barquette wrote later in testimony, "The night was filled with white petals. They seemed endless. Wherever you looked, more were falling." The Germans fired, shouted, ran in circles. But the sky kept opening. For years the German command had boasted of the Atlantic Wall, of fortifications that would bleed any assault dry on the beaches. Concrete bunkers, barbed wire, minefields, all prepared for an enemy coming from the sea. Yet now, before a single Allied soldier stepped ashore, thousands were already behind the wall, scattered across fields and roads where no fortress could stop them. In the diary of that same German sergeant from the 91st Division, the entry continues, "We were certain the wall was impregnable. But now men fall from the clouds. How can we defend against the sky?" The night deepened. Fires burned where planes had been hit. The earth trembled under the constant drone of more aircraft arriving, wave after wave. Confusion spread like wildfire through the German ranks. Some units rushed toward the beaches, convinced the paratroopers were only a feint. Others doubled back, certain the main battle was already in their rear. No map matched the chaos. And above it all, parachutes continued to drift, ghostly and unstoppable, the whisper of their fabric carrying louder in the imagination than any artillery barrage. What had begun as a quiet night in Normandy was shattered. The dogs no longer barked. The fields no longer lay still. The sky had torn itself open, and out of it poured an army. The war in France had not begun at the water's edge. It had fallen from the heavens, straight into the German rear. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Morning, June 6, 1944, Normandy. Dawn bled into the mist like ink in water, turning the hedgerows a dull green and the flooded meadows the color of tin. The air smelled of wet grass, cordite, and apple blossoms bruised by boots. Cows bawled at distant explosions, and somewhere a church bell rang unevenly, as if unsure whether to call the living or mark the dead. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st had been promised neat drop zones on sand table models back in England. Morning proved every model a lie. Flak and low clouds had scattered sticks across miles of fields and marsh. Men woke on separate islands of ground with no officers, no radios, and no idea whether they were inside their own plan or someone else's disaster. A private wrote later, pencil gouging damp paper, "Morning light showed I was in an orchard alone. Germans were shouting down the lane. I kept still, face in the grass, and heard bullets whip the leaves above my head." Another man cut himself free from a parachute snagged in a poplar tree and dropped into a ditch already crowded with two strangers and a radio that would never work again. A lieutenant swung through a barn window, boots landing amid hay and the soft cluck of terrified hens. When he looked up, two parachutes hung from rafters like pale, ruined flags. But the light also brought direction. Small clusters formed by magnetism more than rank, 5 here, 7 there, men orbiting the calmest voice they could find. Without maps, they chose the simplest mission they all understood: break what the enemy needs. They planted charges under culverts, tugged phone wires down from poles, jammed them into hedges, and left roadblocks of farm carts and felled trees where convoy speed would die. The German picture blurred by the minute. Patrols sent to restore order found none to restore. A truck rolled around a bend and met a road cratered during the night. As the driver tried to turn, a burst from a hedgerow tore the windshield into glitter. The answering fire raked hedges already empty. A kilometer away, a bridge that existed at sunrise no longer did. Reports reached local headquarters as fragments: enemy present, unknown strength. Ambush near the poplars, possibly a platoon. Church tower occupied, correction, only one sniper. Then the lines went dead, and the officers stared at receivers as if willpower could make them ring again. In the lanes, the Americans moved like rumor. A corporal with 6 men, none from his company, took a crossroads by shouting as if he had a platoon, then melted away before the counterattack arrived. A demolition sergeant, knee-deep in marsh water, fished a satchel charge from the mud and laughed once, a dry bark. When it still lit, the bridge he brought down sent a German staff car into the stream, maps washing downstream like leaves. Villagers watched from behind shutters, the morning turning their faces a chalky gray. Some slipped out with bread, with a bucket of water, with a nod nobody would mention later. Others crossed themselves and shut the door against whatever the day intended to do. For the paratroopers, nothing felt heroic. It was wet, hungry work measured in heartbeats and hedges. They were under strength everywhere and, because of that, present everywhere. That paradox became the morning's weapon: the smaller they were, the larger they seemed. A squad that fired from 3 angles sounded like a company, a single bazooka in a hedge made a battalion break and fan out. By 8 o'clock, German captains tried to drag a front line out of the chaos and could not. Pins on maps meant nothing when roads were cut and couriers simply did not arrive. A unit ordered toward the beaches halted 3 times at phantom threats and once for a real one. A lone paratrooper who fired 2 rounds vanished, and left them pinned by their own fear. An officer scribbled in his field book, "Hand unsteady, main attack unclear. Enemy behind us in unknown numbers. Bridges, lost. Roads, contested. Communications, impossible." The Americans improvised faster than orders could follow them. A sergeant led 4 men into a phone exchange and found it empty but for a clerk who raised his hands and began to cry. They smashed the switchboard with rifle butts until glass crunched under their boots, then slipped out the alley just as a German half-track roared up, guns swinging at windows that held no one. Mid-morning sun burned off the fog, exposing wreckage like bones after a tide. A cart lay on its side, wheels still spinning. A parachute sagged from a steeple, its lines tangled in the weathercock. In a ditch, a man from Iowa wrote a single line in his notebook, "We are everywhere and nowhere, and for once that helps." German attempts at coherence thinned into guesses. Staff officers argued whether the paratroopers were merely raiders, a prelude to feints at the actual beaches, or the opening move of something larger. Every answer demanded troops they no longer could move quickly, because every road ran through an ambush they could neither find nor fix. Columns backed into farmyards to wait for orders that would never catch up to them. The Americans, still lost by any traditional measure, made the morning belong to them. They fought for intersections, not glory, for minutes, not miles. Every delay they created would be paid back with interest when someone else hit the beaches. None of them knew that, not fully. They only knew the Germans were guessing, and guessing wrong. Near noon, a field telephone in a village school crackled, an exasperated voice demanded to know who held which road. The sergeant at the set looked at his men, 3 different regiments stitched into one exhausted knot, and smiled without humor. "Tell them," he said, "we hold the ones they need most." The French schoolteacher, white-knuckled at his desk, took down the message and dared to laugh, just once, and very softly. By the time church bells told the hour, the shape of the day was set. The beaches still waited, but the arteries that fed them from the German rear were cut, frayed, or clogged by fear. And in headquarters that should have pulsed with certainty, officers stared at blank lines and snarl-ups they could neither count nor clear, speaking the truest sentence of that morning without meaning to. They no longer knew who was attacking them, or from where. June 6, 1944. First light reached the windows of the German command post in St. Lo. The building, once a lycée, now reeked of tobacco smoke, sweat, and the metallic sting of overloaded phone wires. Messages arrived in fragments, half-sentences shouted through static, then silence. Clerks scribbled until their pencils broke, maps littered with arrows that no longer meant anything. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84 Corps, stared at a wall plastered with charts of the Atlantic Wall. His staff had been trained to expect an invasion from the sea, not this. All night the telephones had rung, each call worse than the last. Enemy parachutists in Carentan. In Saint-Mireglise. Near the Douve River. Reports of bridges destroyed, convoys ambushed, staff cars overturned in ditches. None of the accounts matched in detail, but all carried the same chilling certainty: the enemy was already behind them. One transcript from that morning survives in the archives, recorded by a stenographer whose hand cramped before dawn. A lieutenant colonel's voice cracked through the receiver: "American paratroopers, thousands, Herr General. We cannot count them. They cut the road at Pont El Abbé. Our units cannot move." Then the line went dead. The room erupted in argument. Some officers insisted it was impossible. No army would risk so many aircraft in a night drop. Others shouted that it must be a diversion, a raid to distract from the real invasion yet to come on the beaches. A colonel slammed his fist on the table: "The Atlantic Wall is impregnable. They cannot bypass it in the air. This is only harassment." But even as he spoke, a new wave of engines rumbled faintly over the town. Men in the courtyard rushed outside, craning their necks. More C-47s crossed the morning sky, dropping more parachutes into the patchwork of fields beyond the horizon. For a moment the officers inside froze, the sound pressing into the walls like a truth too large to deny. General Marx barked orders, demanding reinforcements. But reinforcements required roads, and the roads were no longer theirs. Couriers on motorcycles failed to arrive. Field phones went silent, their wires cut in the hedgerows by unseen hands. Maps filled with red pencil began to resemble wounds that would not clot. Across the region, German formations stood paralyzed. One battalion was ordered to march toward Carentan. An hour later, it radioed back in panic, reporting it had been hit by fire from hedgerows on both flanks. The strength of the attackers? Unknown. Casualties? Severe. Then nothing. Another unit tried to move north, only to find every bridge over the Murderette blown. Engineers were dispatched but never reported back. Inside the St. Lo command post, the tone shifted from disbelief to something darker, doubt. Reports contradicted each other so violently that no one could tell what was real. A captain pointed at the maps and demanded clarity. Where is the Schwerpunkt? Where is their main attack? The answer was silence, broken only by the staccato of typewriters recording chaos in neat lines. At 5 o'clock, a message reached General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army. He was told of landings, on a broad front, but the details blurred between rumor and fact. Dahlmann, exhausted and pale, muttered, "This cannot be the main invasion. The beaches will decide it. The beaches." But even as he spoke, more reports arrived, an entire German regiment cut off from its headquarters, bridges lost to explosions heard miles away, columns stuck in villages where unseen Americans fired and vanished. The German staff wrestled with a paradox. The fortifications on the coast were untouched, yet their rear was burning. The Atlantic wall still stood, but the veins feeding it were slashed open. How could they hold the beaches if every road leading there was contested? One officer, breaking under the pressure, shouted, "It is madness. If they are only raiders, why do they come in thousands? And if they are the main force, then our wall has already failed." The debate spun without resolution. Some argued to wait for panzer reserves, others demanded immediate counterattacks, but every proposed movement collided with the same problem: the roads were gone. Every time they tried to move, reports came back of paratroopers ahead. The enemy was nowhere in strength yet everywhere in effect. A staff diary from that morning captured the frustration in a single line: "We have no picture. Only fragments. Only fire." As dawn stretched into full light, the truth became unavoidable. The battle had not begun at the waterline. It had begun in the orchards, the meadows, the ditches. It was already raging behind German lines, invisible on maps, undeniable in reality. And when the phones rang again, no one could answer with certainty whether Normandy was still theirs at all. Morning, June 6, 1944. The sun lifted above the Norman hedgerows, its light striking narrow lanes that twisted like veins through the countryside. The roads were ancient, flanked by earth banks and thick walls of green, hedges so dense that a man could vanish 2 paces off the track. Along these lanes, the German army tried to move. Trucks rattled, half-tracks groaned, columns of infantry stretched in uneven files. Their orders were simple: reinforce the coast, drive the enemy back into the sea. But the roads no longer belonged to them. The paratroopers, scattered and disorganized though they were, understood instinctively what to do. A lieutenant of the 101st gathered a dozen men, none from his original platoon, and planted them at a crossroads near Popoville. With 2 bazookas and a machine gun, they turned the narrow junction into a choke point. Hours later he would write in his pocket notebook, "We were 12 against, perhaps, 100. But they could not advance, because the road was ours." The Germans arrived in force, boots crunching, rifles slung. Yet at the first burst of American fire, the column recoiled. For nearly an hour they skirmished, convinced they had stumbled into a much larger enemy. When they finally outflanked the position, the paratroopers melted away, vanishing into orchards. By then the German timetable was broken. Elsewhere, a handful of troopers from the 82nd mined a culvert. They waited in silence until the lead truck of a convoy reached the bridge, then triggered the charge. The explosion shattered the stone, dropping the vehicle nose first into the stream. The road behind it snarled instantly. More trucks piled up, engines idling, horns blaring in futile frustration. German officers shouted, ordering engineers forward, but the bridge was gone. And from the hedgerows nearby came the rattle of a machine gun. 5 Americans, unseen, fired short bursts, vanishing before a proper counterattack could be mounted. That single ambush held up nearly a battalion for half the morning. For the men in Feldgrau, it was maddening. They had expected to move in strength, entire regiments pushing toward the beaches. Instead they found themselves stopped by shadows. Reports came in of enemy strongpoints holding key roads. Yet when German scouts advanced, they found only a few corpses, a burned-out jeep, or nothing at all. The enemy was never where he should be, but always where he mattered most. A captured diary from a German captain records his despair: "We march with battalions, and are stopped by handfuls. The hedges conceal them, the roads betray us. We are not fighting soldiers, we are fighting ghosts." Meanwhile, the paratroopers fought their own private battles. Ammunition was scarce, food almost none. Many carried only what they had landed with, magazines damp from the night's drop, grenades jostling in their pockets. Yet every moment they delayed a column was victory. Every skirmish stretched the hours, and hours were all that mattered, for on the beaches to the north, other Americans were already wading through surf, clinging to the hope that reinforcements would not arrive in time to crush them. Villagers saw the duel unfold from doorways and barns. Columns of Germans halted, their officers red-faced with rage, pointing helplessly at blocked roads. And then, from the fields, came cracks of rifles, bursts of fire, a grenade lobbed from a hedgerow. When the dust cleared, the roads were empty once more, the attackers swallowed back into the land. A French farmer whispered afterward, the roads had become rivers. And in those rivers, the Americans swam unseen. For German headquarters, the effect was catastrophic. Orders sent at 7 o'clock to push a regiment toward Carentan were still unfulfilled at noon. Messages promising reinforcements to coastal strongpoints never arrived. The Atlantic Wall, so carefully planned to meet the enemy at the water's edge, stood unbroken, and irrelevant, because its lifelines were strangled inland. An American officer, reflecting years later, captured the paradox: we were lost, scattered, half-armed. But in that maze of hedges, even 12 men could hold a division at bay. We didn't have to win outright. We only had to make them late. By midday, German generals demanded to know why their reserves had not reached the beaches. Subordinates offered excuses that sounded more like riddles. Bridges gone. Roads blocked. Columns delayed by heavy enemy presence. But no one could define what heavy meant. In truth, it was often fewer than 20 men, firing from the cover of apple orchards. The frustration boiled over in command posts. One officer snapped at his staff, "Do you not see? The roads have vanished. Our army cannot move." And indeed, in a sense, they had. Not because the roads themselves were gone, but because every mile had become contested ground. Every hedge held the possibility of fire. Every junction was a trap waiting to be sprung. German generals complained the roads had vanished. But the truth was harsher: it was their entire strategy that was disappearing. June 6, 1944. Around 4 o'clock hours, the small Norman town of St. Mireglise burned. Flames leapt from a house near the square, throwing sparks into the night. Villagers ran with buckets, shouting prayers, the church bell tolling wildly above them as if trying to summon mercy. Into this chaos drifted parachutes, pale shapes lit orange by firelight. Some floated gracefully onto rooftops and gardens, others collapsed against walls, dragging men across cobblestones. One of those parachutes caught on the church tower. Private John Steele of the 82nd Airborne hung suspended, his lines tangled in the stone. The bell boomed inches from his head with every frantic pull of the rope below. Bullets cracked through the night, shouts echoed, and Steele dangled helplessly above it all. He pressed himself flat, feigning death, watching in horror as the square below dissolved into battle. German soldiers rushed in from side streets, firing blindly into the glow. Civilians scattered, some cut down in the confusion. American paratroopers, landing amid the fire, opened up with rifles and grenades, their shadows jerking across the burning walls. To Steele, the scene was nightmare: men stumbling, screaming, flames painting the night a furious red. Later he would say, "I prayed the rope would snap, but it never did. I could only watch." The town itself became a trap. Fire illuminated every movement, making paratroopers easy targets. Dozens were cut down before they could free themselves from their gear. Yet the same fire drew in more Germans, who crowded the square in the belief they faced only scattered raiders. They did not realize the drop zones around St. Mireglès were among the largest of the invasion. Through the orchards and hedgerows, small bands of the 82nd filtered in. A sergeant with a busted radio let 8 men through a garden wall and struck the Germans from behind. Another squad seized the mairie, turning its windows into firing slits. Villagers, terrified but desperate, pointed out German positions, whispering from cellars where children hid. The fight raged street by street. At one corner, a machine gun tore into a German patrol, sending survivors scrambling into alleys. At another, a paratrooper hurled a satchel charge into a truck, the explosion rocking the square and collapsing part of a stable. Smoke mingled with the stink of burning hay and cordite. Private Steele still hung above it all, numb from the straps cutting into his legs, watching friends and enemies fall alike. German soldiers spotted him eventually, pointing rifles upward. But distracted by incoming fire, they left him dangling, a grotesque witness to the struggle that turned the town upside down. By dawn, the balance shifted. Reinforcements from scattered drop zones reached the outskirts, converging like streams into a river. German units, surprised by the swelling tide of resistance, faltered. Some attempted to withdraw, only to find roads blocked and hedgerows bristling with unseen rifles. Others held firm until grenades shattered their defenses. At sunrise, St. Mireglès was no longer a battlefield but a fortress of the 82nd Airborne. The Americans raised their flag over the town hall. Villagers emerged hesitantly from hiding, stunned by the transformation. One elderly woman pressed her hands to her mouth, whispering, "They are here. Truly here." The cost had been brutal. The square was littered with bodies, both American and German, twisted in grotesque tableaus under smoldering rafters. Houses were gutted, orchards scarred. Yet in the still morning air, amid the rubble and the acrid smoke, there was a change that could not be undone. For the first time in 4 years, a town in France was free. German reports from that morning reflect the shock. Enemy airborne units captured St. Mireglès before dawn. Situation unclear. Resistance stronger than expected. The understatement hides the truth. St. Mireglès was the first French town wrested from German hands on D-Day, and it had been taken not by armored divisions or naval bombardment, but by men who dropped through fire in the middle of the night. Private Steele was eventually cut down from his perch and taken prisoner, only to escape later that day. His survival became a legend. But for the people of St. Mireglès, the greater legend was the sight of American flags where Nazi banners had flown only hours before. For the Germans, it was a night of horror, confusion, fire, and the sudden realization that the enemy was already in their streets. For France, it was the first breath of freedom. June 7, 1944. Normandy woke under a grey sky, its fields scarred by the thunder of a night and day unlike any before. Smoke clung to the hedgerows, drifting over orchards where parachutes still hung in tatters from trees. Cows wandered loose across ditches filled with shell holes. Villagers moved cautiously through ruined barns, whispering the same words again and again, "Less Americanes, less Americanes." In German headquarters, the tone had shifted from confusion to dread. Telephones rang without pause, but few lines connected. Officers barked questions at maps already meaningless, their neat grids slashed by reports of missing bridges, cut wires, lost convoys. Couriers arrived pale and mud-spattered, delivering fragments, a regiment delayed at the Murderette, a supply column ambushed near St. Mireglès, a staff officer killed on the road to Carentan. One telegram after another carried the same refrain: roads blocked, reinforcements late, contact with divisions broken. At La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Rommel received the first consolidated reports and spoke words that hung like lead in the room: "This is not a raid. This is catastrophe." For the Americans, the chaos of the first night had begun to settle. Men who had stumbled alone in orchards were now gathered into companies. Officers, long missing, reappeared at crossroads, rallying knots of soldiers into fighting groups. Makeshift battalions took shape, improvised but determined. Their task was no longer simply survival. It was to hold the lifelines, bridges, towns, and roads, that the Germans so desperately needed. A sergeant of the 101st wrote in his field journal that morning, "We finally had 30 men together. Enough rifles, a couple of machine guns. We didn't know if we were winning or just buying time. But we knew one thing, the Germans weren't moving. And if they weren't moving, the beaches might live." On the coast, the Atlantic wall still stood in stone and steel. Its bunkers were intact, its guns dug in. Yet without reserves rushing forward, without supplies reaching the front, its strength drained away with every passing hour. The Germans had built a fortress facing the sea, but now the battle raged behind it, in the patchwork of fields where paratroopers refused to yield. Contrasts were everywhere. Massive concrete casemates loomed untouched, yet German convoys meant to resupply them sat idle behind wrecked bridges. A battalion that might have crushed a beachhead found itself stuck in a Norman lane, pinned down by fewer than 20 Americans hidden in hedgerows. Armored vehicles idled for lack of fuel because a single culvert, destroyed in the night, remained impassable. By the afternoon of June 7, the shape of the invasion was unmistakable. Allied troops were pouring inland from Utah and Omaha. Their foothold was tenuous, but every hour stretched the odds in their favor. And every hour, the paratroopers held. In one German report, a colonel's frustration bled through the formality: the enemy appears in every direction. Bridges gone. Roads occupied. Telephone lines cut. Divisions are isolated. We cannot assemble our strength. His conclusion was bleak: the battle cannot be decided at the beaches. It is already decided in the fields. For the men on the ground, the reality was simpler. They dug in along hedgerows, set up machine guns at crossroads, planted mines in ditches. They were exhausted, hungry, scattered, but no longer lost. The enemy came at them in waves, and each time, though outnumbered, they held long enough for the invasion behind them to grow. Civilians emerged cautiously, carrying water and bread to the Americans, slipping information about German movements. A farmer pointed with trembling hands toward a road where a convoy had halted, its officers arguing over maps that no longer matched reality. An old priest led paratroopers through a churchyard gate, whispering, "This way, faster." The lines between soldier and villager blurred in that dawn of liberation. The Germans, who had once trusted in the permanence of their Atlantic wall, now saw it crumble without a shot fired at its strongest bunkers. It crumbled because the arteries that fed it had been severed from above, by men who had fallen through clouds in the dead of night. By evening, the reports piling on Rommel's desk spoke not of victories to come, but of an army collapsing into fragments. Every message was another admission of paralysis: roads lost. Bridges destroyed. Communication impossible. The words formed a dirge, the soundtrack of a strategy unraveling. And so the truth of Normandy emerged. The Germans had prepared for a battle they would never fight. They had readied themselves for a massive frontal assault on beaches, for tanks grinding against concrete walls, for artillery duels across the surf. But the decisive struggle was already behind them, carried out by scattered paratroopers who had turned hedgerows into fortresses and crossroads into weapons. Rommel himself, bitter with clarity, said later, "We expected them on the shore. But the war fell on us from the sky." That was the final lesson of those days. America had learned not only to fight with force, but with surprise. And in Normandy, surprise had proved stronger than walls.